Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life. And for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual practices. My name is Forrest Inslee, and in this episode, we'll be talking to Tri Robinson, rancher, environmentalist, retired evangelical pastor, and author of several books. He is also the subject of a recently released film entitled Cowboy and Pastor, The Life and Times of Tri Robinson. In this strange era when so many religious folks deny climate change and actively ignore issues of environmental injustice, Tri has dedicated much of his life to persuading conservative Christians that their faith actually requires them to care for the earth. At the same time, Tri stands with those who stand outside of conservative culture and offers visions of a new kind of Christ follower and a new kind of church. In his most recent book, Reform, The Decline of American Evangelicalism and a Path for the New Generation to Reform Their Faith, he writes, "It is my belief that one day an emerging generation will grasp the biblical values of environmental degradation as it relates to the world's extreme poor and other issues of social injustice such as human trafficking, human inequality, civil rights, and the rejection of foreigners." In this episode, we'll explore this hopeful vision and learn how this man moved past religious politics to become an advocate for God's love toward all of creation. Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. So, Troy, you've got a film coming out this month. It's called Cowboy and Preacher, The Life and Times of Tri Robinson. Maybe tell us a bit about this film and tell me why someone thought it was important to make a film about you.
I don't know why he thought it was important to make a film about me, but I'll tell you kind of the story is that I had written a book, actually two books, almost 20 years ago. Well, 15 years ago, Saving God's Green Earth, and then another book called Small Footprint, Big Handprint. Saving God's Green Earth, it was a unique book in its day in the fact that no evangelicals were writing books about the environment and why Christians should be taking the lead on creation care and the crisis that in those days, I mean, climate change was like almost a brand new term, even though we understood nobody was talking about it, especially in a conservative Christian crowd. And so the book made, somewhat of a splash in the evangelical world. I'd been on a numbers of interviews and radio talk shows and things talking about it. Really experienced actually a tremendous amount of pushback, and it was pretty painful, to be honest. The book told the story of how I came into this new epiphany reality that Christians should be leading the way in this and why it was a biblical thing. And anyway, the book made its way to England, and there was a filmmaker over there named Will Fraser. And he read the book, and he himself was working in this big Gothic church. He was a choir director and also an organist in this big Gothic church in downtown London. And he read the book, and he was asking himself the question is, why do American evangelicals, why are they so opposed to this idea of climate change? Now, you got to understand, he's living on an island, and the people in England get it and got it a long time ago, as did many of the European countries, knowing that they're going to get storm surge and they're going to have horrible ramifications of this problem if it actually materializes. And he just couldn't understand why Christians were opposed to it in America. And so I was actually teaching a conference in Oxford, and my wife and I were over there, and he found out about it and got on a bus and went, took a bus all the way from downtown London all the way to Oxford to have like a half-hour meeting with me. And he confessed to us that he wasn't really a devout Christian. He was working in this church, but he was struggling with Christians, and he was kind of trying to find his way into this deeper relationship with God. And I thought that was pretty interesting that he wanted to, talk to me, about something like this. And so he, anyway, said, I'm a filmmaker. I want to make a film about this issue, and asked the question, why are American evangelicals so opposed to, for example, climate change, but really anything that smacked of environmentalism? I said, because a lot of people say a lot of things. I said, well, that's fine, but Idaho's a long ways from London. It would be an expensive venture for him. But he says, no, I'm going to do this someday. Well, I think maybe 5 years went by, and I get a phone call from him or an email. He says, I'm bringing a film crew, and I'm going to come over to your ranch to film your life on this sustainable farm in the hills of Idaho. He had this kind of infatuation with the American West. I think there wasn't a Western movie he hadn't seen. And so he was all excited to kind of come and meet some cowboys, kind of a thing. And so one day I pick him up at the airport. He has this film crew, and he comes up, and he lives with us on the ranch here for about, I think, 6 weeks. And they're just filming daylight till dark. And the thesis is that he's this Englishman who's trying to figure this out. He hears about this American rancher, and he decides to come and meet him. And so he flies over. I meet him at the airport. He comes up here on the ranch. And so the whole thing is this discussion, but it really hits this issue of why Christians should care and why they should literally not just care, but be on the front lines, be leading the way in this issue of creation care. Since we, all the way back as far as Genesis 9, were commissioned to do it. That's kind of how it came about. And the thing is, I told him, I said, I'm not really a cowboy. I'm kind of a rancher, farmer. My wife and I, we call ourselves farmsteaders, because we just have this sustainable farmstead. We grow everything organic. We raise beef, we raise lamb, we raise poultry, we have orchard, we have a garden, we have a vineyard, we make wine. I mean, we just sort of jacks of all trades, doing all this thing when it comes to making the land as sustainable as possible. We make our own dirt, basically, out of animal waste. I mean, we're trying to cycle everything, and so we're practicing a lot of these things. Our house is on solar, and I'm doing it because we love to do it, but I'm also doing it as an example for people to say, you can do it, and it's amazing how much food you can produce. I mean, we now have, I think, 160 acres, but most of the food is produced on 3 acres. I'm trying to practice what I preach. We have to take better care of this earth and be more mindful how we are producing the things that we need to exist on this earth without damaging everything in the process because of greed and because we want it, we want ours now, and we don't care about future generations and so on. And that's the part of this too, is we're involving our whole family, our kids and grandkids, and I mean everybody's here, and has a part to play.
You alluded earlier to the fact that speaking this message about the necessity of the church to maybe awaken to their responsibility to creation care, that speaking that message met with a lot of opposition, and that there was probably some pain involved, certainly some dealing with rejection, I'm guessing. But nonetheless, you have written about it extensively. You've taught about it quite a lot. And you were teaching about it before many people of the Christian faith were doing that, especially in the evangelical church. So my question is, where did that come from? This message that has really taken hold of your life. What's the genesis of that message?
It was 2000 or 1999. It was right before leading up to the Gore Bush election. And my kids, I have two adult children, and we had this conversation at the dinner table, and it got off on politics, which is always challenging with young adult children. And anyway, they said to me, a lifelong Republican conservative, by the way, that they weren't going to vote in this election, coming up election. And I go, what do you mean you're not going to vote? You're an American, like everybody votes. And like, you have to have a conviction. There we go. we do have a conviction. And on one hand, we care about the environment. And on the other hand, we care about the sanctity of life. And we fully feel that if we vote one way, we're voting against one thing, or if we vote the other way. And so we're not voting. They literally threw their vote away, voted right in. But then they said to me, Dad, remember, they're raised in church. I'm an evangelical pastor. They go, we've been in church our whole lives, and why is it that we've never heard one message on creation care in the church and our responsibility for caring for the environment? What's amazing in all of this is I was really an environmentalist back in the 60s, 70s before I became a Christian. And then as I got through the Jesus movement and into the, church growth movement and charismatic movement. And I mean, it just became a taboo subject. I never thought too much about why that was, but I always sort of knew it was a subject you just didn't touch as a pastor. Anyway, I started thinking about it because I had raised my kids in the mountains. We've always lived out. My wife and I first got married in the mountains in Southern California, that without electricity, with only spring-fed water, in this really remote place. And we raised our kids there for 20 years. I was a school teacher at first and then got into the ministry later. And in the summers, we would go up and work for this friend of mine who was building stretches of the Pacific Crest Trail with a team of mules. And I had horses and we had pack animals. And so I'd pack in my family into the backcountry to his camps. And we would spend the summer. That's when I was a school teacher. We would build stretches of the Pacific Crest Trail. So some of the best memories of their life were living in the Sierras, Nevadas, and just had a love for that. At the same time, they were committed Christians. I've always loved creation, and had a huge appreciation for it. But all of a sudden, I realized there was disjointedness between my life and my values and what I was actually saying and doing from the pulpit. Well, anyway, all this to say is that after I got confronted by my kids, I started reading the Bible. And I actually started reading the Bible with a green felt tip marker from one end to the other, starting in Genesis and going through. And everywhere I found any passage that dealt with God calling his people to care for the land, give it a Sabbath rest, or whatever it was, I would highlight it in green. And all of a sudden, I realized I had a green Bible, man. And it wasn't just the Old Testament; it was the New Testament. And I realized, for example, that in Romans 1, Paul talks to the Romans, and he says, "Man is without excuse from knowing God because He's revealed Himself through His creation, His divine power, His eternal nature. I mean, everything about the nature of God is revealed through nature." And boy, that struck me. Stuff like that. I go, wow, here I am, an evangelical who says he cares about evangelism. And I am actually demonizing, or at least saying nothing about this huge means of bringing people to Christ. My daughter at the time was like one of the top salesmen for the Sierra Club, which was really in the enemy camp in a way. I just thought of her as kind of a radical, and my son was working for REI, so he was really into that outdoor recreational company and business, and so I realized they were kind of moving away from kind of church life, not God, but church, because of this issue, because this oxymoron, and this thing they couldn't understand, almost hypocritical. I realized that my generation of pastor were saying things to young people, especially like you'd rather worship the creation than the creator, or you're just a tree hugger, or all these kind of antagonistic type things that we would say. And then we'd say stuff based on Hal Lindsey's old book that, Late Great Planet Earth, it's all going to burn anyway, so you don't need to care about that. We just need to get people into the kingdom. And yet, taking this thing where God's revealed himself, brought assurance of who he is and his very nature. I mean, when you think about creation, it's all about restoration and reconciliation and renewal. I mean, we had a fire come through here a few years ago and it just blackened this land. I mean, it just looked like the apocalypse, as many are experiencing right now in your state, in Oregon, California, and here too as well. I mean, and there, you just look at this and you're just going, it's over. I mean, this is horrible, you know. And then the next winter or the next comes, and then the next, and the snow falls, and then the spring comes, and then the wildflowers and the grass just becomes lush and green. You know, what what was looked like meant for evil turned out to be for good. The land was renewed. And you know, you think of a mountain stream, if left to itself, it'll purify itself in 100 yards. You know, I mean, it's just everything in nature is programmed for restoration and reconciliation. God can so easily be seen in his creation. So that was something I'd never really thought about as a pastor, that I was actually turning people away from the gospel because of, I can't say I was negative, I just didn't say anything. Anyway, that's sort of how it started. And then I I decided to preach. Now here I am in a capital city in a very red state, successful evangelical pastor, you know, in a city, and politicians in my church, mostly Republican politicians. And I decide that I'm going to preach this message on the assurance of God. How do we know God exists? I was actually teaching in the first John at the time. John opens, you know, by saying, you know, we saw him, we experienced him, we heard him, we touched him. I mean, we can assure you that he is who he says he is because we're firsthand witnesses. And that's an assurance. And we've always taught in my denomination that the activity of the Spirit is an assurance. When we see people healed, when we see God moving in people's lives, that's an assurance. And so there's numerous, you know, assurances. The Word of God and the validity of that. And, I mean, that's an assurance. But creation is also an assurance. And so I preached this message called the neglected assurance, and it was my first message ever on the subject. And I'll tell you something. I prepared 6 months for this message because I just wanted to have my ducks in a row. For one thing, I believe that discipleship is a verb. It has to show action, you know. And so I don't like to preach unless I have an opportunity for people to practice what I preach. And so I wanted to put all these things in place so that immediately when I preach this message, I could give people things to do to go exercise this truth. I preached this message, but I really was nervous. I was coming out of the closet kind of a thing, you know. Literally, it was three services at the time, and I had three full services in there. And at the end of every service, I got a standing ovation. And literally, I broke into tears, especially the first service where that happened. I couldn't believe that I was getting that. These people were waiting for a pastor and a leader to say this, and they're just waiting for it. It's like I gave them. Here, I'm in Idaho, right? Like everybody loves the mountains. That's why they're here. But they never could connect their faith with that. In fact, there were so many people that were in the closet, environmentalists and Christians. This was crazy. It just made no sense. So anyway, then I wrote Saving God's Green Earth. And of course, then that kind of spread out until I was speaking in other places and writing more and so on. I kind of joined this underground movement. These were Christian environmentalists that were really trying to convince Christians that this is really theirs.
So what year was this when you preached those initial sermons that were the breakthrough for you?
Right after the turn of the century, you
Hmm.
know, yeah, it was probably 2001 or two.
Right.
I think I wrote Saving God's Green Earth 2005. I was pretty passionate about it and went after it, and still am, and still do, and even to the
Hmm.
point of trying to live it out now in my retirement.
Some of the dynamics that you described that were true back then, this sense that people were waiting to hear this, that they were primed for that message, that they recognized this as truth, that God is revealed in creation, for example. That's still true today. And I think that especially with younger generations, I find that many of the people I speak to about creation care and the church will actually look at the creation care issue, or rather the church's aversion to that issue, as a reason that they cannot see the church as relevant to their lives.
That's right.
So many people have walked away from from the church because to them it doesn't make sense, as it didn't make sense apparently to your children. And so I'm wondering, here we are in 2020, and not a lot has changed. And yet you would think that people are still primed to hear this truth, that there are still people longing to hear this message, this connection between faith and caring for the earth. What do you think is going on?
Let me go back there because that takes us back to the 80s. But let me say this first. Millennials are leaving the church in droves. And there is not a millennial alive, or at least that I've met, that doesn't know that climate change isn't a real issue. And so when they hear my generation say that it's not real, or denying it, or just saying it's cyclical, and then they're looking at what's going on right now, all up and down the West Coast, and the hurricanes in the South, and the tornadoes. I mean, everything is a record breaker. Everything is bigger than any time in recorded history. How can anybody really deny that we have a problem? I mean, my fear is that we're standing on the edge of the cliff and we're just about ready to jump off. And millennials and that generation around the millennials are afraid. There is a deep fear. They're not going to have a future on this earth if it keeps going the direction that it's going. But they're not turning to church for the hope and the answer because the church is sitting in this place of denial, or at least the evangelical church is. And their political views, which, by the way, is where all this started in the moral majority of the 80s, when a group of very powerful evangelical leaders got together and decided that they were going to take on certain subjects and they were going to hammer these things, and these were going to be the issues that they were going to champion actually politically. And sometimes I think, you know what? I don't know. I mean, this is cynical, but sometimes I think they figured that they couldn't change anything with prayer, so they wanted to turn to politics. But historically, and I just wrote a book about this, by the way, called Reform, or I wrote it 4 years ago about what I believed would come. The tagline was "The Decline of American Evangelicalism and a Path for a New Generation to Find Faith." And it was really about this issue. What happened to evangelicals that they became so politicized, literally being able to control who was going to be the president? How did that happen? And how did these two camps form? And how did the environment, for one, get thrown into the enemy's camp? Because that's exactly what happened. And it came down to, in that case, was Roe versus Wade in 73. And, I was a new Christian at the time, but I mean, nobody could deny in the circles I was running with that abortion was a bad thing. It's not something, to us, it was life, it was a human life, and it was a valued life. So it was a value we all shared. We had this deep belief in the sanctity of life. And see, back in the 60s and late 60s and early 70s, my generation were environmentalists. And there was a book written by York called The Population Bomb. And everybody read it. And basically he was saying that the world population was going to grow to 8 billion people in our lifetime. And the world couldn't sustain that. It wouldn't become sustainable anymore. And it's real scary, the thought of that, because here's why. I was born in 1948, and the world population in 1948 was, I think, 2.2 billion people. So from the time of creation, the Garden of Eden, it took all the way to the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s for the world population to grow to 1 billion people. So late 1800s, mid 19, we're at over 2. And now, when the population bomb came out, I think the world, it was over 5 billion. So in my lifetime, it had already doubled. So it wasn't unbelievable for us to think that it could go 8, 10 billion people. And according to him, from a scientific view, the rainforest would be affected, animal life would be affected, and of course, ultimately, human life would be affected. But we never connected that idea with the sanctity of life, because everything we thought about the sanctity of life was the preborn. So we had this kind of smaller idea about what the sanctity of life was. An important idea, but a smaller idea than the fact that, this earth needs all life and it all works together. And without it, human life can't exist. What happened was some of these secular environmental groups, the Sierra Club, Greenpeace, and some of these groups, they still were standing in this fear and this belief that the earth was going to be affected by human population. And so they actually supported legislation for Roe versus Wade. Well, immediately they were the enemy. And with them went the entire environment. As this great chasm was developed. And that's what happened, to where we realized our major leaders of the kind of the religious right leadership of the evangelical movement were, we can't care more about polar bears or seals than we can about unborn children, that kind of thing. So that kind of rhetoric came out. And so that's why we were the way we were. In my book, I trace the kind of the evangelicalism and kind of up through that now, because there's wonderful things about evangelicalism. My wife and I, we were off to the mission fields and we were like smuggling Bibles into China. I mean, we were just like, it was just an incredible experience. That's kind of how that came about. So in my book, Reform, I said, and this was 4 years ago, I said the 2020s is going to be the 60s on steroids. The same pretty much issues, social justice issues, racial tolerance, the environment. We were talking about the greenhouse effect in the 60s, and now we're talking about climate change, which is just the reverse of the same problem. But now here we are. We're in the middle of all these crises every day, environmental crisis, and more coming. I think that, for example, we're going to really see more than we are right now. I think we're going to really see some issues with food on the planet and world hunger, and in this country as well. The hope is Christ, and the hope is that we're not, this isn't catching him by surprise. And he's looking for a faithful people, not to go and hide, not to hoard, but to get on the front lines. When you think of what's going on, for example, in Bangladesh, where the storm surges are now covering their farmlands, and so there's this mass migrations of people as a result of climate change. The church, instead of denying the problem, should be actually on the front lines helping the poverty of these areas.
We've been speaking to Tri Robinson, an advocate for reform and a prophetic voice for a new kind of faith that is grounded in love for the earth. It is the mission of Earthkeepers podcast to amplify such voices, but to do so, we need your help. When people search for podcasts, they often look to listener reviews as they try to figure out if a podcast will be interesting or trustworthy. So, if you are a regular listener to this podcast, you could help us reach more of the people who need the Earthkeepers community by leaving a review in Apple Podcasts. You'll find the link to do that quickly and easily in this episode's show notes. And as an added inspiration, the first 5 people to post a review will get a copy of Tri Robinson's book, Reform. Just send us an email to podcast@circlewood.online and let us know when you posted the review. As always, we want to express our sincere gratitude to all of our listeners for standing with us as we advocate for our planet. Thank you. I want to explore that a little bit because, to be frank, my exposure to you and your thinking actually happened through that book, Reform. And the thing I took away from the book was actually a sense of hope in the midst of despair. That you saw a way forward for the church when, at the time, I saw the decline. I thought, how on earth is the church ever going to have a future when this is going on, when they're so out of touch, not only with the reality of climate change, for example, but also the reality of the priorities of the next generations. What is this hope? You just said the hope is Christ, but practically speaking, what does that mean? If there is hope for the church in some form, what might that look like?
Well, that's the point of the book. Reform, a new form will emerge, and that's why I start. The first chapter is what was. The second chapter is what is, and the third chapter, or what was in 4 years ago, and the third chapter is what will be. So it's almost a prophetic picture of where I think it'll go. But it's important to read the what was, because there are cycles in Christianity throughout history, starting with Jesus and the apostles. The Pharisees had become political, and so this new form emerged through Christ. And the book of Acts takes off, and it was a whole new form of faith, you know, and it was alive, and it just spread, and it affected people. And God was on the move, and historically many times, but the Reformation was another example of Luther. The church had become political, Catholic Church, and it had become controlling, and it had lost its way. And all of a sudden, this young millennial, off the college campus, basically rises up with this message of basically the book of Romans, and says, everybody should have a Bible. We shouldn't have it interpreted for it. Literally, what he did, he brought in the arts, he brought in the printing press, which was social media. I mean, he just brought it all in, and all of that science. Everybody was poo-pooing science, and he was saying all of this is under the authority of Christ. And it's not something to push away, it's something to embrace. And of course, the Reformation took off, and out of that, really, the Renaissance, and then John Wesley and Methodism. He had a new method, a new form of preaching the gospel out of the Church of England, which was political, and it was controlling, and all of a sudden they wouldn't let him. They persecuted him. The only place he could preach was on his father's gravestone, because it was the only property that he had the right to stand on. And so the church basically have kicked him out, and he started what? A new form. And out of that, in part, came the Great Awakening and this massive move of God. Well, the Jesus movement, in much, much lesser way, was similar. The mainline church had become quite political. And then we said, we're going to have a new form. We're not going to be baptized inside the church with sprinkling of water. We're going to do it in the ocean. And, we're going to meet in gymnasiums, and we're going to have a new dress code. We can wear holes in our Levi's and long hair and whatever. It's like, and it was just like free, and it was like, and it was a new generation, and it was just like, it was exciting. And had it not been for that, I wouldn't have probably been in the ministry. That just ignited my wife Nancy and I. My thesis in Reform, even though it's hard to see right now, moves of God always never comes out of good times. It always comes out of cultural disjuncture, when everything's upside down and backwards, and there's a lot of fear in the air, and there's apprehension of what the future is going to bring, and nobody knows, and then all of a sudden, generally a young generation rejects the old, and that right now is what we're experiencing and seeing. It doesn't feel good, you know. One of the kind of kingdom principles, it seems like, is that the old form will always persecute the new form. That always has happened. And I think that, well, what we see in this new move of God among this new generation, we're not going to like. My generation, for the most part, isn't probably going to like it. God's on the move right now, even working through something as bad as the coronavirus, where he literally has shut the church down from its old form. He's put it online, and it's a new form. I don't know if it's the new form, but I got a feeling there's something exciting coming. And I think we're going to actually see a new move of God through all of this. And it's going to be alive, and it's going to transcend all the crisis and all the problems.
It seems to me that you're linking that then to this idea that Christ's followers need to be on the front lines of advocating for the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a sense of justice in that, environmental justice, or justice for the rest of creation, not just humanity. But it makes me wonder then, how far does that justice equation go? What does this have to do with maybe the broader realms of social justice? And we see a lot of that right now being of concern to younger generations. How much of that do you think might factor into this new form, whatever that is?
But I think that the characteristics of this move is going to be compassion, justice, and mercy. it takes us back to the essence of the gospel. Jesus, when he started his ministry, he said, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord's upon me. He's anointed me to what? Preach the gospel to the poor." That's number one. Heal the brokenhearted. I mean, go into the trenches with the people that are broken and need Christ and need God. And I also think, and this is another thing, I think it's going to look a little liberal. And that'll be another reason that evangelicals will push back on it so long. Because who cares about social justice? Who's really, pushing on the racial injustices? Who's pushing on the environmental crises? And it's the more liberal part of our country. And I know my granddaughter's one of those. She and I have gone round and round, but I realized, you know what? A lot of my thinking has come from just watching her generation and seeing where they're doing and how they're expressing their faith. And it's not the way we did.
Our listeners come from all generations, and all of them care about doing, about taking action. If you were to address, say, the younger folks and would have any advice for them in terms of being part of this change, contributing toward even the creation of new forms, what would you say to them?
I'd say, don't give up. Don't become lethargic. Be passionate, but focus your passion in righteous ways. And know that God is real. He's alive. He's well. He's not being caught by surprise. In fact, this is a divine moment. So seize the moment.
What would you say then to people who've maybe been around the block and people who have in the past been committed to older forms, say the evangelical church? How would you advise them if they wanted to see something different, or at least support the difference being developed and created? What advice would you give to them?
When you see it, don't demonize it. Don't be negative. Don't push back on it. Encourage it.
We've been speaking about reform in generational terms, but I will say that a lot of the interesting experiments that I've seen have actually been intergenerational, where perhaps a lot of the energy is coming from the dissatisfaction of younger folks with old forms. And yet there are plenty of people from all generations who are understanding that change has to happen, that the church must be in a different place, especially in terms of its stance and involvement with advocacy for the earth.
I agree with you. And I know
Yeah.
those people. I hang out with those people.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a lot of them. I'm excited, actually, about where this could go. And I hope I'm around when it happens because I want to be a part of it.
We've been in conversation with Tri Robinson, author of several books and the subject of a recent film called Cowboy and Preacher. If you want to know more about Tri's work, his books, or how to watch the film, you'll find information and links in this episode's show notes. Just go to www.circlewood.online/Earthkeepers. We invite you to become a financial supporter of Earthkeepers. Please visit our website at circlewood.online to make a donation that will help expand the reach and frequency of this production. And please share this podcast with anyone you know who seeks to become an agent of change and advocacy for the good of the earth. Earthkeepers podcast explores ways in which we can change ourselves, our communities, and our cultures to help us to care for the earth in holistic and regenerative ways. Through curated conversations, we highlight the wisdom of thought leaders and change agents who are making a difference and showing us a way forward. When Earthkeepers stand together, they amplify the impact of their resistance against environmental injustice and multiply their efforts for renewal and restoration. This podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization whose purpose it is to accelerate the transformation of humanity into life-giving inhabitants of creation. I'm Forrest Dinsley, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Forrest Reed is our sound engineer and the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman. Thank you, friends, for listening. And please join us for for our next conversation on the Earth Keepers podcast.